And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Simon Kinney, technologist and educator whose work combines probing questions with technical thinking. He is the author of the book, A Critical Introduction to Tarot, examining the nature of a belief in tarot, which we're going to talk about today and more. Simon, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Simon, I'm just getting to know you here today, and probably most of my audience are as well. So can we start with a little bit of your background and how you got inspired to write a book about tarot?
Absolutely. So I came to tarot first as a taboo object in my upbringing. So it was something that wasn't allowed to be used, and so it retained a little bit of mystery to me. But it was later on in my life, whenever I got my first tarot reading, that I really confronted what it meant. You know, what does it mean? How does it work? So tarot is a divinatory tool. It's 78 cards, very similar to standard playing cards. And they're split up into two different categories. The first is called the Major Arcana, which are archetypical images such as the magician, the devil, which is one of the reasons why it wasn't allowed in a Christian context for me, but lots of other lots of different images. And then the second part of the tarot deck is called the Minor Arcana, and that's quite similar to the standard playing card deck. So there's 4 suits, although the suit items are different than the French-style playing cards that we're probably most familiar with from poker. Yeah, so it's a divinatory tool. So I came across it by being given a reading, and at the time I had left the Christian faith, and I was I guess you could call it a scientific materialist. So I didn't have a lot of time for practices such as that. But it was later on that I thought, as I was studying philosophy, that dismissing beliefs like that out of hand, it suddenly became untenable to me, and I thought that it deserved more attention. So what I did was I read a lot of the tarot literature and tried to look at it from what I discovered was an uncommon vantage point, which was to try to find out what the philosophical basis would be to support a tarot practice. So, what would the beliefs? What are the roots of the beliefs that are required to for a tarot practice to actually work?
Earlier, did you say that the cards are a divinatory tool? And if so, what do you mean by that?
That's right. It's a good question, actually. The standard answer would be that it's another word for fortune telling. So just to find out what's going to happen in the future. But actually, tarot authors prefer to call it a divinatory tool because it's got a bit of a bigger meaning than just fortune telling. So divination would mean communication with God or the gods or the spirit realm, whatever you want to call it. Depending on the belief structure you're operating within, it would change what that might mean. It can even mean a connection with the so-called collective unconscious, which or even just your own personal unconscious unconsciousness. So so it is the word comes from divine, as you might have guessed, but it's not the original use of tarot. Tarot was originally a card game, and it developed into this practice. Much like other games and games of chance have been used for other divinatory practices, such as rolling dice or flipping pages of a book can be a way to read fortunes.
Now, you have a Christian background, and you mentioned that it was taboo to be involved in tarot. So when you were not doing it, were you afraid, or Did you feel like it was just something shameful?
I wouldn't have been afraid, but it would have had connotations with evil things or with forbidden things. So I suppose that's the double-edged sword of having something forbidden is that you maybe inspire a bit of fear, but also a little bit of interest. And it's probably not a great way to approach things for young people because they might get interested. Um, but no, for me, it was a way to come to terms. Actually, writing the book was a way to kind of confront some of those things from my past, and not necessarily out of fear, but just out of a lack of understanding. And I suppose for anything, a lack of understanding can be can cause fear for sure. But by the time that I had begun to get interested in it and write about it, I was quite a lot more ambivalent about it.
What was it that finally inspired you to get your first reading?
Actually, it wasn't something that I sought out. A friend of mine decided to give me a reading one. I think it was like a rainy Saturday afternoon, nothing else to do in my early 20s, and I thought, okay, I don't have any time for this, but I'll do it for a laugh, kind of thing. And I've read that same story for a lot of people, actually. And as the cards came out, it was so how a tarot card reading works is that the usually a card reader will shuffle the deck. They will have in mind some way to lay out the cards on a table, which is called a spread. So it might be a three card spread. So it might be we put three cards next to each other, and where they are usually has some significance as well. So one popular three card reading is that you put three cards on a table, and left to right it might be past, present, and future, and then they'll be interpreted in that way. So having the spread there gives a kind of ready-made framework for the imagery of the on the cards to be projected onto. Um, and so as they come out, it's and everyone will have this experience that, and it's really just about interpreting why this is happening, not that it is happening, which is that the cards come out and you'll find that there's an uncanny, correspondence with your own life. Maybe in the present, I don't know, maybe the tower comes out, which shows a tower being struck by lightning and being broken in half and two people falling out of the tower. So it's one of the most evocative cards, which is why it springs to mind now. But if that's in the present slot there, you might connect that. Well, I lost my job recently, actually, so this seems to line up with that, or whatever might be going on with you. Um, so then it's just about whether or not that actually has a connection to real events, whether or not it's a psychological projection from you. But in the book, I decided to not just reach for the easy the easy interpretation, like I'm showing it now, or like I'm describing it now, of okay, your mind can fill in the gaps, but what would it actually mean for that to have a real meaning, and what kind of philosophy or belief structure would support that. Um, so I had that experience of being uh, kind of impressed and also confounded slightly by it, but I had to reach for some kind of meaning.
Do you feel that there is a quantum physics explanation for why it works?
There certainly is an explanation for it. Whether or not it's reasonable or not is something to explore for sure. But in the book, in a critical introduction to tarot, I outline that from my perspective, there's two things that prop up not just belief in tarot, but in modern magic and even witchcraft practices. One of them is quantum mysticism, and the other is Jungian psychology. So, what quantum theory has done in physics has really undermined uh, Newtonian idea of causality in the universe. So the usual uh, a usual example case might be, well, how do we explain that whenever a snooker ball hits another ball, that it moves, and so we can use Newtonian physics for that. But if we get smaller and smaller, and look at the quantum particles, which wasn't possible until in the 20th century, we can see that it's not causal in the same way. It's probabilistic. Obviously, we could go into more detail, but hopefully that's enough for now. But we could, and what that's done is it's opened the door for different interpretations of causality. The famous double slit experiment shows that, or in one or several interpretations, it seems to show that observations change how matter actually operates. In a critical introduction to tarot, I explore that there's a short jump between observations and measurements. So what's actually going on is a measurement, but we conceptualize that as an observation, and it's conscious beings that make observations. So that's allowed to kind of retrofit uh, magical practices, like how they work, and to speculate. It's allowed magicians, which is tarot readers, lots of people, to speculate that this is the thing that's causing that's allowing for tarot readings and so on to work. Um, that's one of the pillars. The other one is Jungian psychology, which is also a very interesting avenue.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about that.
Sure. So, Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychologist who was Freud was his mentor, Sigmund Freud. So, really, between the two of them, they really set up a modern view of psychology. Um, it was Freud that started the interest really in the unconscious. It had been in uh, in development before his time. But whenever we talk about the subconscious and unconscious in our common everyday sense that we do now, it's really because of Freud. And Jung as well had a big impact on this. They differed in how in some of their theories, but for both of them, it was the source of the kind of confusing and compelling behavior in humans that we find hard to understand. Because if everything was conscious for us, then we would surely understand ourselves very well. We wouldn't be confused by our urges or desires because everything would be available to us in consciousness. Um, Jung went further, though, in his theories and proposed that beyond the personal unconscious, there was a collective unconscious. And that's where the archetypes reside. So for him, archetypes were it's similar to Platonic idealism in philosophy, where it's that there are these. I mean, there's many interpretations. It's actually something quite complicated, but in one way of looking at it, it's where the templates for behavior are, or maybe they're what people referred to in the past as gods. Even could be how we experience commonalities in things like alien abductions, any kind of pattern that is difficult to explain that people experience. It for him, it wasn't necessarily physically real, but that it was real psychologically, and not only it wasn't just a hallucination. Maybe is a good way to distinguish it from the maybe the more Freudian way of looking at it, that there was a common reality, and that there is a common reality in the psyches, between the psyches of all humans. And so that's how it's one way that we can justify both magic, tarot readings, and so on.
Why do you think it's so popular today?
I would say there's many reasons for that. One thing we can see is that it is more popular. There's been many more tarot card decks produced in the last few years than there's ever existed. The early days of tarot, it was created in the 15th century in Italy, and it was there was a few decks there. They were made for aristocrats. It was several hundred years later that they were popularly reproduced on cheaper cards for people to use. Um, in the past, let's say the 18th and 19th century, the common style was called the Tarot de Marseille, which was a woodcut printed uh, card with very simple coloring. But modern tarot really starts with the development of the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, which was created by A.E. Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. They were members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an English magical society that was based on Freemasonry as the structure. It was founded by Freemasons, but it was magically oriented, whereas Freemasonry isn't. And so that deck, I mean, it might have been, uh, tarot may have been even lost in obscurity even today if it wasn't for Stuart Kaplan of US Game Systems, who bought uh, the copyright, basically the patent, to be able to reproduce it in America, and has made it really popular through that. So those are the facts, let's say. And then as tarot's become more popular for other reasons, it's been experimented with, and lots of different kinds of decks have proliferated. Some of them, the earlier ones, were feminist ones, like the Mother Peace Tarot deck. But you'll see tarot deck for every kind of niche today. Cute ones, serious ones, magical ones, movie themed ones. Um, I spoke to many tarot readers and authors about why did they think that it was become more popular, because it's a somewhat difficult question to answer. The consensus seemed to be that it was because it contained archetypical imagery that really resonated with people. One tarot author said that behind all 78 doors is the entire world. Paraphrasing, but that it's all of human experience is summed up by the cards. At least that's the aim. And the success of of tarot decks and their increased popularity seems to speak to that is true. That people do find that it's a good tool for divination, that it's interesting, and that it continues to speak to people's experience, even though it was created and the archetypical imagery is largely unchanged for the last 600 years.
Is tarot, in your opinion, only for fortune tellers or for everybody?
In a critical introduction to tarot, the answer that I come to is that it's for everybody. There's really a lot of different ways that it can be used. It can be used to play games, like normal games. I have a friend who has created a game for it recently. That's uh, like a game that's based on the rules of collectible card games like Magic the Gathering and so on. And I predict actually that there's going to be a resurgence of popular games that come out for the tarot deck in the next in the next decade and going forward. It's one thing that's very interesting about tarot is that it's not really owned by anybody. There's no one group that really owns it. It I my research indicates that it's heavily Christian oriented, which is somewhat ironic because it's denounced by Christians. Um, Earlier versions of the tarot before the 20th century, one of the main cards was called the Pope, and whenever Waite remade the tarot at the start of the 20th century. I mean, he was a Christian mystic, so he left the Catholic Church, but he maintained a God-centered approach his entire life, and he saw his work as being Christian. And I suppose what it said to me was, what is the status, I suppose, of Christian mysticism? And I think mysticism in Christianity is something. There's a kind of love-hate relationship. The mystics seem to have pushed on the theology, but that's a dangerous thing. It's a thing that is it's difficult to bring that into the orthodoxy that seems so important to the kind of culture of Christianity. So there's that aspect that's very Christian, but it's been adopted by neo-pagans as well, and as I mentioned, it's very popular in witchcraft practice. It's maybe a little bit ironic because in the past, people were called witches, but it was pejorative. It wasn't something that I think many people sought out. Maybe it's similar to how punk has become, famously adopted by the people who are vilified by the term. I wonder if that's some similar dynamic is in operation there. But it's been enthusiastically adopted by witches, and actually, I think that some of the reason why there, especially in the last few decades, there's newer newer tarot card decks with non-Christian imagery is to try to put a little bit of distance between that heritage and the ways that people want to use it today. So yeah, it's really not owned by anyone, and there's many ways to use it. I think a lot of artists too really love it uh, for the classic imagery. It's very particular, but also because it covers so many topics, and many artists want to make their own tarot deck as a kind of as a big project where you have a template, but you can really express yourself through it.
I think it's amazing that one of the cards was called the Pope. I had no idea about that.
In French, yeah, Le Pipe. And today, or since the Rider-Waite-Smith, he renamed it to the Hierophant, which is a word meaning like a leader within a cult, but like a mystery cult as opposed to a death cult or something like that. More like the ancient mystery schools, like for example, that Pythagoras would have had. Um, so that like Pythagoras might be considered a hierophant. But if you look at the image of the card, it actually still shows, even though it's called the Hierophant, it still shows the Pope. It's got the three-stage crown that the Pope wears, and there's two monks in front of him, and he kind of ministers to them on a throne. So yeah, and that's just one of several examples. Another is the Lover's card is Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
That's again a change that was made by Waite. The Lovers in the Tarot de Marseille has three people on it, and instead of two, and it's a little bit more of like a lover's quandary than kind of the archetypical first man and woman that in the Christian Bible. But the devil as well is there. That figure is only meaningful in a Christian context. There's a lot of different examples.
Can you tell us some more? Because this is fascinating for me.
Sure. So the devil card is based on the image is based on the image that Eliphas Levi, I think I'm saying that right, 19th century French occultist, developed of Baphomet. So Baphomet is a like demon that stands in for the devil in this case. He used it to as part of his occult studies in demonology, which is the study of demons and so on, but not in a negative context. Actually, there's an interesting similarity between Levi and Waite, where they both trained as priests but left the priesthood early, both Catholics, and didn't leave Catholicism as such. They left the fold, as it were, but they kept that was their main interest. The idea and the world view of Christianity. Um, in my personal opinion, and I've written an essay about this further to the book, A Critical Introduction to Tarot that I've written. I really see the time before maybe the 70s as where tarot was really a kind of heretical Christian practice. Much the way that Gnosticism, I think, is viewed nowadays. Or sorry, has been always viewed since the Orthodoxy came in around 300 AD. But similar to Gnosticism, and I suppose it's been influenced by it as well. It's just a very different take on what Christianity is, but it's not unchristian or anti-Christian. And I think that it's something that Christians don't really appreciate, I think, is the diversity in Christian thought. It's one of the reasons why I wrote A Critical Introduction to Tarot, was to explore some of those avenues and to show the diversity, I think, in that thought, because it's easy to be to not know the history. I suppose it takes a bit of effort to stand outside, because it's potentially challenging, and potentially might make people think twice about the beliefs that they hold. So that's not always what people want to do, or that people encourage. But yeah, the tarot's always existed within a Christian context, and I think it can be rightfully seen as, at least in its time, maybe before the recent neo-pagan upsurge, it could be seen as a Christian practice. There's a great book that came out last year by Brittany Muller. It's called The Contemplative Tarot, which was her attempt um, to make an actual modern Catholic practice out of it, and to use it. So she reinterpreted the entire tarot deck, apart from its sort of traditional meanings, at least the meanings that have been in circulation for the last few hundred years, as established by the French occultists, and to uh, interpret them more in line with her take on Catholic theology, more mainstream theology. So it was actually an effort to bring it from, let's say, the fringes of a kind of heretical occultism into a mainstream Catholic theology. Very interesting aspect to the very vibrant tarot culture that we see. I mean, it only came out last year.
I was wondering if it's possible that tarot even predates Christianity, because I feel like in some areas, Christianity came and spread across the land and kind of converted pagans into Christians. And so perhaps some of the pagan activities, especially of mysticism, or I don't know if activities are the right words, but activities or ideas of mysticism kind of got intertwined with Christianity, like Easter, or the Easter bunny symbol, and the Santa Claus symbol. So I wonder if tarot kind of came along for the ride.
There's an aspect of that, and there's something to it. But let's see. So if we look at the facts, tarot cards were created in around 1430, I believe, in Italy. That's well after the advent of Christianity, of course. But it came at a time just at the start of the Renaissance, the end of the Middle Ages, where the Italians of the time, especially the well-educated aristocracy, were, what the Renaissance was trying to find ways to include previous pagan ideas from especially the Greeks, and it was the rediscovery of that Greek heritage. But the goal was to show how these pagans actually had how they, because in the Christian worldview, uh, God speaks to everybody, even before the coming of Christ and before even non-Hebrews and so on. So the idea was to try to show how they were God inspired in some way. So that's when we have, Neoplatonism. I mean, Neoplatonism comes from much before, but that was part of what that's about. So we see astrology coming into being used by Christians. Um, so popes up until, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's either maybe the 17th century, routinely consulted astrologers. It wasn't seen as antithetical to the Christian rules and beliefs as it is today. Um, so there's definitely um, you know an interaction and a relationship between older ideas and Christian ideas in the tarot. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tarot itself predates it, but interestingly, the whenever tarot was discovered or rediscovered as a occult object, it was done in France in the occult revival of the 18th century, where it was, now we know, mistakenly thought to have been ancient Egyptian uh, book of knowledge. So the fabled Book of Thoth um, was that was what someone thought that it was, and it became a popular theory. This was at the time in France whenever Napoleon had conquered Egypt as well, and artifacts were coming back. So there was, I think it was even called Egypt mania. Much like Beatlemania, I suppose, of the 60s. Or so it was on everyone's mind, and but that was, oh, and another aspect of why that was a popular idea was because uh, the Romany gypsies would do card readings. Now, they actually didn't use the tarot that much. Reportedly, they used playing cards, which were more available for their divination, and palmistry, actually, more than anything, I believe. But the association with card-based divination and fortune telling with um, I think it's not an appropriate term anymore, but with what they called at the time gypsies, um, and the idea that their original ancestry was Egyptian, kind of created this little um, compelling idea to some. And it was until the English philosopher and tarot enthusiast Michael Dummett, he did some really groundbreaking work to try to sort the facts from the fiction, as almost like a hobby project. And really, he's the preeminent scholar in tarot history that everyone refers to. So certainly, I think that what you picked up on is true, but I think it will be a stretch to say that they pre-existed, although that was a theory several hundred years ago.
Can you talk about tarot's connections to things like politics or Freemasonry?
Well, it's complicated enough. Maybe we could take two angles. So if we take contemporary politics, it would be, we could see tarot in the context of larger kind of witchcraft movement, and that might be a good way to look at how tarot is involved in politics, contemporary politics. So yeah, there's a kind of empowerment movement that takes that's a part of contemporary feminism, which has adopted the figure of the witch as a kind of a female empowerment symbol. And what we see today, as well, is many people trying to create a witchcraft practice. And as part of that practice, many are using tarot cards. So within that, there's political critiques of from the feminist angle of patriarchy, but also there would be strong associations with ecology and anti-capitalism and so on. So that's one aspect that would be quite visible today, especially in the literature on witchcraft. To do with Freemasonry, there's the very curious aspect of the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck being created by members of the English Society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the fact that that was essentially structured around the same rites and so on as Freemasonry. So the I suppose people would have suspicions about uh, Freemasons and the links with the Illuminati and so on, and as well about the symbols that are on the tarot themselves. That they're, I think that there's something goes hand in hand with a suspicion of symbols and symbolic activity, and then people who use symbols in magic. So I think that you see that in the tarot culture as well, or certainly in reaction maybe to tarot culture as opposed to the culture itself. So yeah, it's a deep one. Do you have any particular angle that you'd like to look at, or any of your own thoughts?
From what I understand, even Julius Caesar consulted either a psychic or a fortune teller or something. And I think it's fascinating that here we are 2,000 years later still doing that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that it's very normal to do big things in consultation with um, whatever's available to you. In the big moments of our lives, that's whenever I think, I can speak from personal experience. That's whenever I've been attracted to try to ask questions, either of people that I know or of tools like divination. All of all big municipal works or government buildings, all of these things, like they're not just places that house people and important books and that hold important meetings. They're also symbolic of maybe the state, or for Caesar's time, for maybe his own power. And I think that whenever, well, it's not even that I think it, we can just look at the record. Astrologers have always been consulted. Things are always done in a big way. Big things are always done in that way, um, to align with either with the religion or the spiritual practices of the time. So it's really just on whether or not the spiritual practices are something that we accept or understand or not. I know that in America, the was George Washington, wasn't it? That was the Freemason,
Yes.
and it's no secret. Although to some, I suppose, the first time you learn it, I can count myself among that number. That it came as a surprise if you didn't know that already. There's paintings of him laying the groundstone, and all of these things. So it's not on whether or not it's right to do these kinds of rituals and these kinds of things. It's just whether or not one agrees with the particular rituals that are being done. I think that doing things in public will always have a ritualistic aspect, because it's just how we are as humans.
Would it be accurate to say that you were a skeptic, but now is a believer?
I wouldn't use those words. I continue to think of myself as a skeptic. But I mean that in terms of philosophical skepticism. So I wonder about knowledge. I wonder what can we know and how can we know it. And whenever I hear things said with certainty, I I questioned them, and I continued to do that. But what I can say is that in the process of writing a critical introduction to tarot, it was a very useful experience for me in changing my approach to something that I didn't understand, and that I can say I still don't completely understand. But instead of dismissing it, I applied various tools in reasoning and research, and tried to see it from a lot of different angles. And so I would say that I wouldn't necessarily call myself a believer, but I at least I at this point understand the various justifications for why people are interested in tarot, why they continue to use it as a divinatory tool, how divination may work. As I mentioned earlier, the quantum mysticism and Jungian psychology, give reasonable grounding for even a hardened skeptic that there would be a debate there. And so I think it's very useful. And ultimately, I mean, it's not a really, I don't think it's a very valuable approach to think that people are, that they don't have reasons for doing things, that they don't have good reasons for doing things, even if they may seem unusual or silly. It's, I think having respect for people is trying to really understand where they're coming from.
How often do you get a tarot reading?
Actually, quite infrequently. Mainly, I'm kind of either reading for myself or reflecting on the cards myself. Um, but I don't know a lot of tarot readers. I have given a few readings, but I'm a little uncomfortable with that because, as someone who isn't like a practitioner as such, I feel a little bit disingenuous doing it. But I have done it, and I've seen that it works in so far as it works just as well.
Hmm.
So maybe it is like I can't remember. I think it was Niels Bohr, the physicist, had a horseshoe above his door, and someone said to him, why do you have that up there? Surely you don't think that it does anything. And he said, well, I was told that it works even if you don't believe in it. So I think it could be like that. Whenever I've given tarot readings, it seems to work, even though I remain somewhat aloof from belief in it myself.
Hmm. After watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Yes, absolutely.
What's the best way to reach you?
The best way is on my website, simonkenny.co. That's CO at the end.
All right. So if people want to find out more about your book, should they go to Amazon or your website?
A Critical Introduction to Tarot can be pre-ordered right now from Amazon, amazon.com or amazon.co.uk for your UK listeners.
Do you have anything else that you're working on that you want us to know about?
I'm continuing to write about tarot. Uh, as I was saying earlier on, I'm writing essays about, at the moment, exploring the Christian links to tarot, and the I'm feeling out whether or not that argument that I was speaking of earlier on how reasonable it is to consider it a heretical practice, and considering the orthodoxy um, in relation to tarot. But I'm reading currently about transhumanism. I'm very interested in the kind of culture around the wish to transcend what it is to be human. So I think hopefully people can expect some new work from me, maybe in that area. Or I'm also looking into um, childhood experiences with uh, sin talk and different things like that. Those are the things I'm working on at the moment.
Simon, before we finish up, can you give us one last positive message?
Sure. If I could pick one thing from what we've discussed, I think a positive message is that tarot belongs to everybody. It's it's a very interesting thing, even if you find it scary or silly. I think that there is something there for everybody. So if you try to come at it with an open mind, try to be interested in the history, the culture, and wonder why people are interested in it and what's attracted so many people to it for hundreds of years, I think there's something there to find for everybody.
Simon, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thanks for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.